On June 28, 1941, on the seventh day of the war, an elderly teacher from Minsk, Anna, stood by the window of her apartment and watched a column of German tanks entering the city. Her neighbor was crying beside her, but not from grief, from relief. "Thank God," she whispered, crossing herself. "Thank God this nightmare is over." What nightmare was she calling the Soviet regime? Why did the capital of Belarus fall without a single serious fight? And why did NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, reports contain shocking lines about residents in some cities greeting the invaders with bread and salt? For 80 years, this topic was taboo. School textbooks wrote about the nationwide heroic resistance, about how every Soviet person from the first day of the war stood up to defend the homeland. But declassified archives tell a different story, one that is more complex, more tragic, and much more honest. This is the story of how the authorities' mistakes, repressions, and terror led to entire cities being left without protection. Of how people, exhausted by collectivization and arrests, briefly believed in liberation. And of how quickly this illusion turned into a nightmare, far surpassing everything that had come before. Welcome to History Without Embellishments. In Soviet textbooks, the history of the Great Patriotic War began simply and clearly. On June 22, 1941, fascist Germany treacherously attacked the USSR. The Soviet people, as one, rose up for the sacred war. Every city, every village heroically fought against the invaders. This picture was beautiful, inspiring, and patriotic, but it was incomplete. The truth turned out to be much more complex and much more tragic. In the first 6 months of the war, the Red Army lost more than 3 million men as prisoners. Hundreds of cities were occupied in a matter of days or even hours. Many of them didn't just fall, they surrendered almost without a fight. Why did this happen? Were Soviet people cowards? Did they not love their country? The answer to these questions does not lie in the plane of patriotism or its absence. It lies in the plane of the harsh reality of the pre-war years. Imagine a peasant whose entire grain harvest was taken away in 1932, dooming his family to starvation. Imagine an engineer whose father was shot in 1937 as an enemy of the people, without trial or investigation. Imagine a priest who secretly baptized children at night, risking being sent to a camp. Imagine a resident of Western Ukraine or the Baltics who was deported to Siberia a year ago just for owning a small shop. For these people, the Soviet regime was not a protector. It was a source of fear, pain, and loss. And when German tanks entered their cities in the summer of '41, some of them truly perceived it as liberation. Of course, this wasn't everyone. Millions of Soviet people heroically fought against the invaders from the first day of the war. Brest Fortress, the defense of Odessa, Sevastopol, Leningrad. All of this happened. All of it is true. But the other side was also true. True were the cities where not a single shot was fired in defense. True were the people who greeted the Germans with hope for a better life. And the most tragic thing was that this hope very quickly turned into a horror that surpassed all imaginable nightmares. The Nazi occupation regime turned out to be so brutal that even those who had welcomed the Germans soon took up arms against them. This article is an attempt to honestly tell what really happened in the summer and fall of 1941, without embellishments, without excuses, and without lies. Because only the truth, no matter how bitter, allows us to draw lessons from the past. Our grandfathers and fathers deserved for their history to be told in full, with all its heroic pages and all its tragic ones. Only then will we truly understand the scale of their feat and the price of victory. Yes, we truly. But this story begins with catastrophe, with a catastrophe that no one expected. The dawn of June 22 was warm and clear. In the border garrisons, Red Army soldiers woke up for the usual Sunday reveille. Officers planned to spend the day with their families. District commanders were preparing reports. No one was expecting war. But it had already begun. At 3:15 a.m., the first German shells fell on Soviet territory. Tank columns poured across the border. Hundreds of bombers rose into the sky. The most terrible war in human history had begun. But the most terrible thing wasn't that the war had started. The most terrible thing was that the Red Army was absolutely unprepared for it. The commander of the Western Front, General Pavlov, learned of the war's beginning an hour and a half after the first bombings. Communications with the units were disrupted in the first minutes. German aviation methodically destroyed communication nodes, headquarters, and depots. Officers on the ground didn't know what was happening. Headquarters. Some units received orders to advance forward, others to retreat. A third received no orders at all. By noon on June 22, the picture at the front was one of chaos. German tank wedges had deeply penetrated Soviet defenses. Airfields were bombed. Most of the aviation was destroyed on the ground. Ammunition depots were burning. Roads were clogged with retreating units and refugees. Chaos reigned on the very first day. German tanks entered the city before the local garrison could organize any resistance. Soviet troops retreated so quickly that residents didn't have time to evacuate. Many didn't even understand what had happened. In the morning, they were still living in the Soviet Union, and by evening, they found themselves on occupied territory. A similar picture unfolded in Grodno. The city defended itself a little longer, about a day, but the outcome was predetermined. The city was defending. German units had overwhelming superiority, and the Soviet command simply couldn't react to the rapidly changing situation. Brest held out longer, but that was the defense of the Brest fortress. Handfuls of heroes who engaged in battle without waiting for orders. The city itself was occupied by the Germans on June 23rd. The fortress garrison held out for more than a month, but it was an island of resistance in a sea of catastrophe. What happened? Why was one of the world's strongest armies defeated in the first days of the war? There were many reasons. Stalin ignored all intelligence about Germany's preparations for the attack. The troops were not brought to combat readiness. Many units were scattered in summer camps. Tanks stood without fuel, planes without ammunition. Commanders had no right to make independent decisions and waited for orders from Moscow. And communication with Moscow was lost. But there was one more reason that was not spoken aloud. The army had been bled dry by repressions. In 1937-38, tens of thousands of officers were shot or sent to camps. 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, 57 out of 85 corps commanders, 110 out of 195 division commanders. The army was commanded by people appointed to positions based on loyalty, not professionalism. The result was catastrophic. In the first week of the war, the Germans advanced up to 300 kilometers deep. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. Dozens of cities were occupied. And the most terrible thing was that this was only the beginning. Ahead lay even more. There, events unfolded according to a completely different scenario, and this scenario had nothing in common with heroic defense. When German tanks entered Kaunas on the morning of June 22nd, they were met with flowers. Not everywhere, not by everyone, but they were met. Lithuanian flags appeared on the streets. People came out of their houses to watch the passing German columns. Some waved their hands and smiled. Soviet monuments began to be demolished even before the last Red Army soldier left the city. For those who knew history only from Soviet textbooks, this looked like betrayal. But for those who knew what had been happening in the Baltics over the past year, it was an understandable, albeit tragically mistaken, reaction. On June 14, 1940, exactly a year before the start of the war, the Red Army entered Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Officially, this was called voluntary accession to the USSR, but there was little voluntary about it. The Baltic republics were forced by ultimatum to accept Soviet troops, and then to hold elections whose results were predetermined. For most residents of the Baltics, this became a shock. Just yesterday, they had lived in independent states, small but their own. They had private property, traded freely with Europe, practiced religion without fear. And today, all of this was declared illegal. Nationalization began. Factories, plants, shops, even small workshops, everything became state-owned. Peasants were herded into collective farms. Priests were arrested. Churches closed. In schools, teaching in national languages was prohibited, and Soviet ideology began to be imposed. But the most terrible thing began on the night of June 14, 1941, exactly a week before the war. Mass arrests and deportations swept across the entire Baltics. People were torn from their beds in the middle of the night, given 20 minutes to pack, and loaded into freight cars. They weren't told where they were being taken. No one knew when they would return. About 18,000 people were deported from Lithuania, 15,000 from Latvia, and 10,000 from Estonia. These were not enemies of the people or spies. These were ordinary people, entrepreneurs, teachers, officers of the former army, simply well-to-do peasants. Their guilt was that they could become the basis for resistance to Soviet power. The trains headed east, to Siberia, Kazakhstan, to the camps. Many of the deportees never returned. Those who survived came back only 15 to 20 years later. And then, in June 1941, their relatives remained at home, not knowing if their loved ones were alive, where they were, or if they would ever see each other again. It was in this atmosphere that the war arrived. For the residents of the Baltics, the Soviet regime had managed to become a symbol of repression, arrests, and deportations in just 1 year. And when the Germans appeared, many perceived it as liberation. In Riga, German troops entered on July 1st. The city did not defend itself. Soviet forces retreated without engaging in battle for the capital of Latvia. People came out onto the streets with pre-war Latvian flags. Pogroms began. Soviet institutions, monuments, and apartments of communists were smashed. There were cases of reprisals against those who had served the Soviet regime. Tallinn held out longer, until the end of August, but it was a defense by the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, not a city defense with population support. Estonians, like Lithuanians and Latvians, were in no hurry to defend the Soviet system. Vilnius fell on June 24th, on the third day of the war, without a fight. Soviet troops retreated. The local population did not resist. Moreover, volunteer detachments were formed to fight against the retreating Red Army units. German propaganda quickly took advantage of the situation. In the Baltics, they began forming national SS legions. And there were volunteers. Not all, not the majority, but there were. For them, it was an opportunity to take revenge for a year of repressions, for deportations, for ruined lives. The Germans promised restoration of independence after victory over Bolshevism. The Germans allowed churches to open, returned private trade. In the first weeks of occupation, many really believed that life would improve. But the illusions dissipated quickly. Very quickly. The Nazis had no intention of granting independence. The Baltics was declared German territory. Ostland. Reichskommissariat. Executions of Jews began. About 250,000 Jews lived in the Baltics, and almost all of them were destroyed in the first months of occupation. The forced labor of youth to Germany began. A brutal occupation regime was established. Those who had welcomed the Germans with flowers in June realized their mistake by autumn, but it was too late. The Baltics found itself between two totalitarian regimes, Soviet and Nazi, and both brought only suffering. But the Baltics was not the only territory where the population did not support the Soviet regime. A similar, and in places even more complex situation was unfolding south, on the lands annexed to the USSR under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Lviv met the Germans on June 30th, 1941. The Red Army left the city the day before, and on the evening of June 29th, chaos began in Lviv. The NKVD prisons were opened, but not to release the prisoners. NKVD employees received an order to liquidate all those who could not be evacuated. Shots rang out in the prison yards all night. In the morning, when the Germans entered the city, they discovered thousands of bodies. Prisoners were shot in cells, corridors, yards. Many were simply beaten to death. Lviv residents saw these piles of bodies, and many of them really met the Germans as liberators, because in their eyes, it was the Soviet regime that embodied terror. One must understand the context. Western Ukraine and Western Belarus joined the USSR in 1939, after the partition of Poland. Before that, these lands had been part of the Polish state for 20 years. People had their own life, their own way of life, their own economy, and suddenly, everything changed. The first to come were arrests. The NKVD identified hostile elements: Polish officers, landowners, entrepreneurs, priests, simply well-to-do peasants. They were arrested by the tens of thousands. Many were shot, many sent to camps. Families were deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Then collectivization began. Peasants had their land, livestock, and inventory taken away, herded into collective farms. Those who resisted were declared kulaks and de-kulakized. That is, all property was confiscated and they were exiled. Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, in a year and a half of Soviet power, experienced what the rest of the country had endured over 10 years, but in an accelerated pace, with double the cruelty. Therefore, when the Germans came, many truly breathed a sigh of relief. Lviv, Ternopil, Rivne, Lutsk. These cities were practically not defended. Soviet troops retreated, and the local population was in no hurry to help them. Moreover, in Ukrainian villages, detachments were formed that attacked the retreating Soviet units. They were formed in Ternopil. The Germans entered on July 2nd. The city was surrendered without a fight. Soviet institutions were looted even before the arrival of German troops. Ukrainian flags appeared on the streets. People greeted the German columns, hoping that things would now be better. In Rivne, the Germans arrived on June 28, on the 6th day of the war, again without resistance. The city was abandoned by Soviet troops, and local residents did not hinder the occupation. Many even helped the Germans catch straggling Red Army soldiers and Soviet activists. Western Belarus showed a similar picture. Grodno fell on June 23rd, Baranovichi on the 27th, Pinsk on July 4th. All these cities were occupied without serious resistance. Why? Because for the population of these territories, the Soviet regime was alien, imposed by force. It was associated with arrests, deportations, the destruction of the familiar way of life. People remembered how the NKVD burst into homes at night, how neighbors were taken away and never returned, how the NKVD burst in, how the last grain was taken, dooming families to hunger, how churches were closed and priests arrested. Of course, not everyone thought that way. There were those who sincerely supported the Soviet regime. There were communists, Komsomol members, Soviet activists. Many of them left with the retreating army. Those who stayed often became victims of reprisals. German propaganda worked skillfully. The Germans declared themselves liberators from Bolshevism. They allowed churches to open, and people who had prayed in secret for 2 years, risking arrest, flocked to the temples. They permitted private trade, and markets came alive. They returned confiscated property to peasants, and they gave thanks. Local police detachments were formed from volunteers. These detachments were used by the Germans for punitive operations, maintaining order, fighting partisans. And there were those who wanted to join. Some for ideological reasons, some to take revenge for repressed relatives, some simply to survive, receiving rations. Relatives. Ukrainian nationalists hoped for the restoration of an independent Ukraine. On June 30 in Lviv, a Ukrainian state was even proclaimed. But the Germans quickly showed who was in charge here. Nationalist leaders were arrested and sent to concentration camps. No independence was intended. Ukraine and Belarus were to become German colonies, suppliers of raw materials and labor. And then the realization began. It turned out that the Germans were no better than the Bolsheviks, in many ways, much worse. Executions of Jews began. Entire cities and towns were destroyed. Babi Yar near Kyiv, 33,000 shot in 2 days. Similar executions took place across Ukraine and Belarus. The forced labor of youth to Germany began. Entire villages were loaded into wagons and sent west. Labor conditions were slave-like. Mortality was enormous. Only half of those sent to work in Germany returned. A brutal occupation regime was established. Execution for the slightest disobedience. Execution for sheltering Jews or Red Army soldiers, the whole family. For ties to partisans, burning the village along with its inhabitants. Belarus and Ukraine turned into hell. Those who had met the Germans with flowers in June took up arms by autumn. The partisan movement in Ukraine and Belarus became one of the most massive, and its backbone consisted precisely of those people who had initially been hostile or indifferent to the Soviet regime. But the Nazi occupation turned out to be so monstrous that the choice became obvious. However, the tragedy of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus paled in comparison to what was happening in the East. There, the territories under attack were not recently annexed ones, but cities that had been Soviet since 1919. Cities that were supposed to defend the Soviet system. But they fell one after another, and the first of them was Minsk. On June 28, 1941, on the 7th day of the war, the capital of Belarus was occupied by German troops. The 7th day. One of the largest cities in the Soviet Union, an industrial and cultural center, a hub of railways and highways. And it fell in less than a week. This was not just a military failure, it was a catastrophe of historical proportions. Minsk was to be defended by the troops of the Western Front, the strongest of the border fronts. Here were concentrated the best mechanized corps, modern tanks, aviation. The front was commanded by General of the Army Dmitry Pavlov, hero of Spain and the Finnish War. On paper, everything looked impressive. In reality, however, everything collapsed in a matter of days. Guderian's and Hoth's German tank groups struck north and south of Minsk, aiming to encircle the main forces of the Western Front. The Soviet command failed to organize a counterstrike. Communications were lost, orders were delayed or didn't reach the units at all. Tanks ran out of fuel and stalled. Artillery was left without shells. Aviation was destroyed on airfields in the first days of the war. Without shells. On June 26, the encirclement ring around Minsk began to close. German tanks bypassed the city from the north and south. Soviet troops tried to break through to the east, but came under strikes from German aviation and artillery. Roads were clogged with retreating columns, refugees, and abandoned equipment. On June 27, panic began in Minsk. Soviet institutions were hastily evacuated. The NKVD began shooting the prisoners. There was no time to evacuate them, and they couldn't be left alive either. Party and Soviet officials fled the city on anything that could move. The railway station turned into a place of chaos. People stormed the last trains, clinging to the steps of the wagons. Ordinary Minsk residents didn't know what to do. Evacuate, but where and on what? Stay, but what would happen when the Germans came? The city sank into an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. On June 28th, German troops entered Minsk. There was virtually no resistance. In Minsk, those Soviet units that were still in the city tried to break through to the east or simply surrendered. Minsk was occupied in a few hours. German tanks drove down the central streets under the gazes of residents peeking out from windows. Some hid in basements, fearing bombings and shelling. Some watched the invaders with curiosity. Some cried, realizing that the occupation had begun. Some hoped that the Germans would bring order and end the chaos of the last days. But the greatest tragedy was unfolding not in Minsk itself, but around it. The German pincers closed east of the city.
In the area of Bialystok and Minsk, a gigantic cauldron formed. Dozens of Soviet divisions were encircled, by various estimates, from 200,000 to 300,000 people. The surrounded troops tried to break through, attacking again and again, dying under fire from German artillery and aviation, losing their last tanks and guns. By early July, resistance in the pocket began to weaken. There were no ammunition, food, or medicines. Wounded soldiers were dying without help. Units were losing control and disintegrating into separate groups. On July 9th, organized resistance in the cauldron ceased. The Germans captured about 300,000 prisoners. This was one of the largest military catastrophes in history. The Western Front effectively ceased to exist. The road to Moscow was open. General Pavlov was recalled to Moscow, arrested, tried, and shot on July 22nd, along with several other Western Front commanders. They were accused of cowardice, panic-mongering, and incompetent command. Perhaps the accusations were justified, but did they have any opportunity to act differently amid the catastrophe created by the pre-war mistakes of the country's leadership? For Minsk residents, the occupation began, which would last 3 years. The Germans quickly established their order. A curfew was introduced. The entire Jewish population, and about 80,000 Jews lived in Minsk, was herded into a ghetto. Executions began, in the first 10. By the end of the war, the Minsk ghetto would be completely destroyed. Those who had worked for the Soviet regime, party officials, policemen, activists, were arrested and shot. Many hid, changed documents, concealed themselves with acquaintances. The city lived in an atmosphere of fear. But there were also those who went to serve the occupiers. A city police force was formed from local residents. Some went there out of fear. Refusal could cost a life. Some for a ration to feed their family. Some sincerely believed that the Germans were better than the Bolsheviks. Some simply wanted to survive at any cost.
Minsk residents recalled that the first weeks of occupation were relatively calm. The Germans behaved restrainedly, trying to show that they had brought order. Markets opened, trade began, small-scale private enterprise was permitted, and even several churches were opened. But this was mere facade. Already a month later, mass executions began. But this was a city that regularly shuddered from volleys beyond the outskirts. These were the Sonderkommandos at work, destroying Jews, communists, and underground fighters. By autumn, Minsk residents realized that the German occupation was not order, but a nightmare. However, the story of Minsk's fall was not unique. It repeated itself again and again across the west of the country. And if Minsk was the Republic's capital, then the next city to be discussed was the gateway to Moscow. The ancient Russian city that opened the road to the heart of the country for the Germans, Smolensk fell on July 10, 1941. 18 days had passed since the start of the war, and German tanks were already halfway to Moscow. Only 350 kilometers remained to the capital, 2 or 3 days' march for mechanized columns. It seemed that nothing could stop the Wehrmacht. Smolensk had colossal strategic importance. It was the largest road junction on the way to Moscow. Here, highways crossed from west to east and from north to south. Whoever controlled Smolensk controlled the approaches to the capital. This was understood both in Berlin and in Moscow. But understanding did not mean readiness. After the defeat of the Western Front near Minsk, German tank groups rushed further east practically without resistance. The Soviet command tried to organize defense on new lines, but the troops did not have time to occupy positions. The Germans advanced faster than Soviet units could retreat and dig in. By early July, on the approaches to Smolensk, remnants of the units smashed near Minsk, and fresh divisions hastily transferred from the interior districts had concentrated. But these divisions lacked combat experience, were poorly armed, and did not know the terrain. Many arrived without artillery or transport. They simply weren't delivered in time. German tanks approached Smolensk on July 9th. The city was not prepared for defense. There were no permanent fortifications, no one had dug anti-tank ditches, and there was no time. The population was not fully evacuated. There wasn't enough transport, and besides, no one believed the Germans would reach so quickly. On July 10th, the assault began. German aviation bombed the city. Artillery pounded the defenders' positions. Tanks broke through on the streets. Soviet troops fought, but the forces were unequal. By evening, the Germans had occupied the city center. By night, Smolensk had fallen. There was resistance, but it was neither organized nor massive. Individual units fought to the end, but there was no overall coordination. The command lost control of the troops. Many subunits simply retreated without engaging in battle. The city was abandoned practically without serious fighting for every street, every house. Smolensk residents met the occupation in different ways. The majority simply hid in their homes, waiting out the assault and hoping to survive. Many cried, realizing that the occupation had begun, and it was unknown when it would end. Some fled with the retreating troops, abandoning their homes and property. But there were other sentiments as well. In NKVD reports compiled after Smolensk's liberation in 1943, it is mentioned that part of the population met the Germans, if not joyfully, then at least without hostility. Some hoped that the Germans would restore order after the chaos of the retreat. Some believed that life under the occupiers would be no worse than under Soviet power. Some were simply glad that the fighting in the city had ended and they could come out of the basements. Why did this happen in an ancient Russian city that had been Soviet since the founding of the USSR? The answer lies in Smolensk's pre-war history. The city suffered greatly from collectivization. The Smolensk region was a grain-producing area, and peasants were herded into collective farms with particular cruelty. Dekulakization, exiles, confiscations. All of this hit the countryside hard, and thus the city, which was closely tied to that countryside. The repressions of 1937 to 1938 did not bypass Smolensk either. Hundreds of people were arrested. Party workers, engineers, teachers, military personnel, ordinary people on whom neighbors or colleagues had informed. Almost every family suffered, if not directly, then through relatives or acquaintances. By the start of the war, an atmosphere of fear reigned in Smolensk, as throughout the country. People were afraid to speak aloud, afraid to trust each other, afraid to stand out. The Soviet regime was associated not with care for the people, but with repressions and coercion. Therefore, when the Germans came, some Smolensk residents really harbored hope for change. Not because they loved Hitler or believed in Nazism, but because they were tired of fear and wanted at least some stability. At first, the Germans behaved relatively restrainedly. They understood that Smolensk was the gateway to Moscow, and they needed a quiet rear. Markets opened. Private trade was permitted. Some Smolensk residents even had their property, confiscated during the years of collectivization, returned. Some churches were opened, and people who had not been able to openly practice their faith for 20 years flocked to them. A local administration was formed from those who agreed to collaborate. A police force was created, and there were those who wanted to join. Some out of fear, some for earnings, some out of conviction. But the illusions dissipated quickly. Executions began. The Jews of Smolensk, about 1,500 of them, were herded into a ghetto and then destroyed. Mass roundups began. Young people were grabbed and sent to work in Germany. A regime of terror was established. However, the main significance of Smolensk was not in the city itself, but in what happened around it in July-August 1941. The Battle of Smolensk began. The first major battle where Soviet troops managed to delay the German offensive. Near Yelnya, Red Army units went on the counteroffensive for the first time and recaptured the city. This was psychologically important. After a series of defeats and cauldrons, Soviet troops proved that they could not only retreat, but also advance. That the Germans were not invincible, that they could be stopped and beaten. The Battle of Smolensk delayed the German advance on Moscow by almost 2 months. These 2 months turned out to be critically important. They allowed reserves to be brought up to Moscow, fortifications to be built, and industry to be evacuated. Perhaps it was this delay that saved the capital. But for Smolensk itself, a 3-year occupation began. The city was liberated only on September 25, 1943. By that time, it was almost completely destroyed. Of the 150,000 pre-war population, fewer than 8,000 remained in the city. Those who survived the occupation faced a new nightmare after liberation: NKVD checks. Everyone who had been in the occupation was suspected of collaborationism. Interrogations, verifications, camps for those who could not prove their non-involvement in cooperation with the Germans. Victims of the occupation became victims of their own state's suspicion. But Smolensk was not the last major city to fall in the summer of 1941. Ahead lay another catastrophe. The biggest, the most tragic, the most painful. The city that was a symbol of glory and greatness. The city that the Germans had to take at any cost. The ancient capital that became the site of the largest encirclement in human history. On September 19, 1941, German tanks entered Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the mother of Russian cities, the ancient center of East Slavic civilization, fell after nearly 3 months of defense. But the main tragedy was not in the city itself, but east of it, where the ring of the most grandiose encirclement in military history closed: the Kyiv Cauldron. These 2 words still cause pain to those who know what lies behind them. The battle for Kyiv began back in July. The German army group south advanced more slowly than groups center and north. Soviet troops in Ukraine were stronger and better organized. The Soviet fortified district was one of the most powerful in the country. The city was prepared for defense in advance. But in August, Hitler made a fateful decision for the Red Army. He ordered part of the tank forces to turn south from Moscow to encircle the Kyiv grouping. German generals objected. They wanted to take Moscow first, but Hitler insisted. He wanted Ukraine, its grain, its industry, its resources. At the end of August, German tank wedges began to close around Kyiv. From the north, Guderian's tank group advanced. From the south, Kleist's tank group. The Soviet command saw the threat of encirclement. Marshal Budyani, commander of the Southwestern Front, requested permission to abandon Kyiv and withdraw the troops to the east while there was still time. Stalin forbade it. Kyiv had to hold at any cost. It was not just a major city. It was a symbol. Surrendering Kyiv meant admitting defeat in Ukraine. Stalin demanded standing to the death. On September 5th, Budyani was removed from his post. Kirponos was appointed the new commander, but it was already too late. The German pincers were closing. On September 10, they closed near Lokvitsa. The entire Kyiv grouping, 4 armies of the Southwestern Front, was encircled. By various estimates, from 650,000 to 700,000 people were in the cauldron. This was a huge force, more than the Germans had on the entire southern direction. But the encircled troops had no unified command, communications, or breakout plan. German aviation dominated the skies. Artillery methodically shot up columns of Soviet troops. Kyiv was abandoned on September 19. The last defenders blew up the bridges over the Dnieper and retreated east, straight into the encirclement ring. The Germans entered a city that they had been bombing for 2.5 months. The center was destroyed. Kreshchatyk was burning. The streets were littered with debris. Kyiv residents met the occupiers in silence. Most simply sat in basements, waiting it out. Those who could evacuate did so in July-August. The rest were mainly those who had nowhere to go or who didn't believe the city would be surrendered. In the first days of the occupation, the Germans behaved relatively restrainedly. They understood that Kyiv was not just a city, but the cultural capital of Ukraine. They needed to make an impression. They permitted trade, opened churches. Ukrainian nationalists hoped for the restoration of independence. But on September 24th, explosions began. Soviet saboteurs had mined central buildings before retreating, and now the mines were detonating. The explosions continued for several days. Hundreds of German soldiers and local residents were killed. The Wehrmacht blamed Jews and communists for this. On September 29 and 30, the tragedy of Babi Yar occurred. All the Jews of Kyiv, about 33,000 of them, were driven to a ravine on the outskirts of the city. There they were shot over 2 days. 33,771 people. This was one of the largest mass executions in the history of the Holocaust. Kyiv residents heard shots from the ravine, saw columns of people going to Babi Yar and not returning. But no one could do anything. Fear paralyzed the city. Many didn't believe it was possible, that people were being killed by entire families, including children and the elderly, simply for their nationality.
And east of Kyiv, a military catastrophe was unfolding. The encircled troops tried to break through. Marshal Kirponos was killed on September 20th while trying to lead the troops out of the encirclement. Units fought to the last cartridge. When cartridges ran out, they went into bayonet attacks. When there was no strength for attack, they surrendered. By September 26th, organized resistance in the cauldron ceased. The Germans counted 665,000 prisoners. This was the largest encirclement in military history, larger than at Sedan, larger than at Minsk, larger than at Vyazma. For the Red Army, it was a catastrophe. The southwestern front ceased to exist. The path to the Donbass and Crimea was open. The Germans could develop their offensives almost without resistance. For the prisoners, the road to hell began. The Germans were not prepared for such a number of prisoners. There weren't enough camps. There was no food. Hundreds of thousands of people were driven west on foot. Those who couldn't walk were shot on the spot. In the camps, they died of hunger, cold, and disease by the thousands every day. Of those captured near Kyiv, only a handful returned home. And in Kyiv itself, a regime of terror was established. Roundups began. Men of draft age were grabbed and sent to work in Germany. The city was methodically plundered. Factory equipment, museum valuables, everything of value was simply loaded onto platforms and shipped out. The Reichskommissariat Ukraine was created. The Germans planned to turn Ukraine into an agrarian appendage of the Reich. Industry was to work for Germany. The population was to be a source of cheap labor. Education and culture were planned at a minimal level. The Germans didn't need literate Ukrainians. They needed obedient slaves.
Kyiv residents quickly realized that the occupation was not liberation. Already by the winter of 1941, an underground began to form in the city. Partisan detachments operated in the outskirts. People helped POWs escape from camps, hid Jews, passed intelligence to the Soviet command. The occupation of Kyiv lasted until November 6, 1943. In that time, the city lost nearly half its population. Of 900,000 pre-war residents, about 380,000 remained after liberation. The rest were killed, deported to work, died of hunger and disease, or evacuated. Kyiv was almost completely destroyed. The Germans, during their retreat, blew up buildings, bridges, and communications. The city turned into ruins. It was rebuilt over decades. But the tragedy of Kyiv was only part of the overall picture. In the summer and fall of 1941, cities of Ukraine and southern Russia fell under occupation one after another. And everywhere, the same story repeated. Hopes for the better, quick disillusionment. Terror, suffering, resistance. On October 24, 1941, German troops entered Kharkov, the fourth largest city in the USSR, the largest industrial center of Ukraine, the hub of tank and machine building, and it was abandoned practically without a fight. Kharkov was supposed to be defended. The city had colossal importance. Tanks, tractors, turbines, and a multitude of other military and civilian equipment were produced here. The loss of Kharkov meant the loss of a significant part of the country's industrial potential. But by October, the situation at the front was catastrophic. After the defeat near Kyiv, the Germans advanced rapidly eastward. Soviet troops did not have time to fortify on new lines. Industry was being evacuated, machines, equipment, and specialists were being transported. But not everything could be removed. On October 23rd, the evacuation of party and Soviet organs from Kharkov began. This was a signal to the population. The city is being surrendered. Panic began. Kharkov residents stormed trains, trying to leave for anywhere. Roads were clogged with refugees, carts, and automobiles. On October 24th, the last Soviet units left the city. The Germans entered Kharkov. There was no resistance. Soviet troops retreated without a fight, not wanting to be encircled in the city. Kharkov was surrendered. Residents met the Germans in different ways. The majority simply hid in their homes, but there were those who came out onto the streets. There were many Ukrainian nationalists in Kharkov who hoped that the Germans would give Ukraine independence. There were also simply people exhausted by Soviet power who hoped for changes. Kharkov suffered greatly from collectivization and repressions. The city was the center of the Ukrainian Holodomor of 1932 to 1933. Dying peasants from hunger flocked here, and the streets were littered with corpses. The authorities collected them by trucks and took them out of the city. Hundreds of thousands died. The memory of this was alive. The repressions of 1937 to 1938 also did not bypass Kharkov. It was a major industrial and scientific center, and that meant there were many enemies of the people here: engineers, scientists, teachers. They were arrested by the hundreds, shot in the Kharkov NKVD on Koklovskaya Gora. Families were exiled. Therefore, when the Germans came, some Kharkov residents really had hope that everything would change for the better. But the illusions dissipated very quickly. Already in the first days of the occupation, executions began. The Jews of Kharkov, about 20,000 of them, were herded into a ghetto and then methodically destroyed. By the end of 1941, Kharkov Jewry practically ceased to exist. Mass roundups began. Young men and women were grabbed, loaded into wagons, and sent to Germany. More than 100,000 people were deported from Kharkov. Conditions at the works were slave-like. Many did not return. A brutal occupation regime was established. Execution for the slightest disobedience.
Brutal for sheltering partisans, burning the house along with residents. For ties to the underground, they hanged on the square to intimidate others. Kharkov experienced two occupations. The first time, the city was liberated on February 16, 1942, during the Winter Offensive. But in May, the Germans captured the city again. Kharkov was finally liberated only on August 23, 1943. South of Kharkov, events were unfolding in the Donbass. This region was the heart of Soviet coal industry. Here, coal was mined, steel was smelted, machines were built. The loss of Donbass hit the Soviet war economy no less than the loss of an army on the front. The Germans understood the importance of the region. They advanced here methodically, encircling and destroying one industrial center after another. Stelino, Makayevka, Gorlovka, Kramatorsk. These cities fell one after another. In October-November 1941, many mining towns were abandoned without a fight. In 1941, Soviet troops retreated, and the population was told to stay in place, saying they would return soon. But they did not return. The occupation began. In the Donbass, the situation was special. This was a region with strong working-class traditions, with a high percentage of communists and Komsomol members. Here, Soviet power had stronger roots than in Ukraine as a whole. But there were also the dissatisfied. The Donbass suffered cruelly from the famine of 1932 to 1933. Although formally it was an industrial region, many miners kept vegetable gardens and had relatives in the villages. When the famine began, entire families died. The authorities did not help but continued to extort grain for export. The repressions of 1937 also struck the Donbass. Engineers were arrested for sabotage. If a mine failed to meet the plan, it was not the plan that was to blame, but enemies of the people. Directors of factories, mine chiefs, were shot. Simply experienced specialists. Production fell, but the repressions continued. Simply experienced. Therefore, when the Germans came, the population's reaction was ambiguous. Many went into the partisans. In the Donbass, there was a strong partisan movement. But there were also those who went to work for the occupiers. The mines had to operate. The Germans needed coal. And there were miners who went down the shaft under the Germans. Some out of fear. Refusal meant execution. Some simply wanted to feed their family. The Germans tried to organize coal production, but never reached pre-war levels. Partisans blew up mines and depots. Workers sabotaged production. The occupation regime was too brutal for people to work with enthusiasm. Even further south, events unfolded in Crimea. Crimea had enormous strategic importance. From here, the Black Sea could be controlled, the Caucasus threatened, and the Romanian oil fields that supplied Germany with fuel. Crimea began to be occupied in October 1941. The Perekop Isthmus was breached on October 28th. Soviet troops retreated deeper into the peninsula. Some cities surrendered without a fight. Others defended heroically. Simferopol was occupied on November 1st, practically without resistance. Soviet troops left the city, not wanting to be encircled. The population remained in place. The Germans entered calmly, without street fighting. Kerch fell on November 16th, but here it was different. The city was bombed, stormed. The defenders fought for every street. When it became clear that the city could not be held, part of the troops and population were evacuated across the strait to Taman. The rest went into the quarries under the city. There, catacomb garrisons arose that held out for several more months. Sevastopol became a symbol of heroic defense. The city held out for 250 days, from October 1941 to July 1942. The Germans stormed it several times, suffered huge losses, but could not take it. Sevastopol fell only on July 4, 1942, when ammunition ran out. Food and reserves.
Why did Sevastopol hold out, while other cities fell without a fight? Why then? The answer is simple. Sevastopol was defended by sailors of the Black Sea Fleet. These were professional soldiers with high morale. They had clear command, discipline, and an understanding of the importance of their mission. In the other Crimean cities, however, the defense was supposed to be held by the local population, together with retreating units. The local population was exhausted by collectivization and repressions. Crimean Tatars remembered the mass arrests of 1937 to 1938, remembered the famine. Many of them saw no reason to defend Soviet power. When the Germans came, part of the Crimean Tatars went to collaborate with them. Auxiliary detachments were formed to fight partisans. This was betrayal, but a betrayal that had reasons. Soviet power had alienated these people even before the war. After the liberation of Crimea in 1944, Stalin took cruel revenge. After May 18, 1944, all Crimean Tatars, about 200,000 people, were deported to Central Asia. Along with them, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Armenians were exiled. They were resettled by entire peoples, without distinguishing who had fought for Hitler and who had been in the Red Army or partisans. Collective responsibility. On the North Caucasus, events developed in a similar way. Rostov fell on November 21, 1941. The city was occupied after a short battle, but already on November 29th, Soviet troops recaptured Rostov. This was the Wehrmacht's first major defeat in the war. True, in the summer of 1942, the Germans captured the city again. Krasnodar was occupied on August 9, 1942. The city was not defended. Soviet troops retreated without a fight. The population was left to the mercy of fate. The occupation began, which would last until February 1943. Kuban Cossacks met the Germans ambiguously. On one hand, the Cossacks had suffered cruelly from Soviet power. The de-Cossacization of the 1920s, collectivization, and the famine of 1932. All of this was remembered. On the other hand, Cossacks traditionally considered themselves defenders of Russia. Many went into partisans or fought in the Red Army. But there were those who went to serve the occupier. The Germans formed Cossack units to fight partisans. They promised to restore Cossack freedoms after victory. There were those who wanted to join. The geography of the city's fall was vast, from the Baltic to the Caucasus, from the western borders to the Volga. Hundreds of cities came under occupation, and everywhere the same story repeated. First hopes, then disillusionments, then terror, then resistance. But the main question remained: why did people believe the Germans? Why were they ready to collaborate with the occupiers? What made Soviet citizens greet the invaders? The answers to these questions lay in the history of the pre-war years, and these answers were very inconvenient for Soviet propaganda. And these, in Soviet textbooks, everything was simple. The fascists attacked, the people rose to defend. Traitors were a rare exception. But declassified NKVD archives paint a more complex picture. Reports from special departments, summaries of public sentiments, interrogations. All of this shows that in 1941, the situation was far from unambiguous. Who then met the Germans, and most importantly, why? The first category, dekulakized people and their families. Collectivization broke the lives of millions of people. Peasants had their land, livestock, inventory, and homes taken away. The most well-to-do were exiled to Siberia or Kazakhstan with entire families. Children of kulaks were not admitted to institutes or hired for jobs. They were second-class citizens in their own country. By the start of the war, 10 years had passed, but these people remembered. They remembered how their father was taken away in a freight car, how their mother died of hunger in exile, how their brother was not accepted into school because he was a kulak's son. This memory was alive. And when the Germans came, some of these people truly saw them as liberators. In some NKVD reports, there is a telling case. In one village near Smolensk, the Germans returned a dekulakized peasant's house, which the collective farm chairman had occupied for 10 years. The peasant burst into tears of joy. Neighbors saw this, and some thought, maybe the Germans really are better? The second category, relatives of the repressed. In 1937 to 1938, about 1.5 million people were arrested. More than 680,000 were shot. The rest ended up in camps. Each of them had families, wives, children, parents, brothers, sisters. These were millions of people for whom Soviet power became a source of personal tragedy. Wives of enemies of the people often lost their jobs. Children were expelled from institutes. Relatives turned away, fearing to be seen near the family of a traitor. These people lived in an atmosphere of fear and humiliation, and some of them really hoped that the German occupation would bring changes. There really was a woman in Kyiv whose husband had been shot in 1938 as a Polish spy. When the Germans came, she openly said, "Let it be them, but only not this power." And she was reported. After Kyiv's liberation, she was arrested and given 10 years in the camps for anti-Soviet agitation. The third category, believers. The Soviet regime brutally persecuted religion. Churches were closed and blown up, priests arrested. For baptizing children, one could be fired from work. For wearing a cross, expelled from the Komsomol. Believers were forced to hide their faith. The Germans allowed churches to open, and people went to temples by the thousands, tens of thousands. In some cities, churches opened that had been closed 20 years earlier. Priests who had served in secret, risking their lives, could now serve openly. For many believers, this was true liberation.
Finally, one could pray without hiding, baptize children, marry, bury the dead according to Christian rites. The Soviet regime forbade all this. The Germans permitted it. Of course, the Germans did this not out of love for orthodoxy. It was propaganda, a way to win the population to their side. But for ordinary people, that didn't matter. What mattered was that one could pray without fear. The fourth category, the intelligentsia that suffered from repressions. Among those arrested in 1937 to 1938, there were many teachers, engineers, doctors, scientists. They were accused of sabotage, espionage, belonging to non-existent conspiracies, shot or sent to camps on the basis of false denunciations. Those who remained free lived in fear. Every knock on the door could mean arrest. Every word at work could be turned into a denunciation. The atmosphere was suffocating. When the Germans came, some representatives of the intelligentsia hoped for intellectual freedom. This was naivety. Of course, the Nazis despised Slavs and considered them second-class people. But in the first weeks of occupation, when the Germans were still pretending to be civilized, these hopes seemed justified. Still pre. In Kharkov, there was a university professor who miraculously escaped arrest in 1938. His colleagues had been shot as participants in an anti-Soviet organization. When the Germans occupied the city, he agreed to teach at the institute they opened. After liberation, he was tried for collaborationism. He justified himself. "I just wanted to teach children. For 20 years, I was afraid of every word. It seemed to me that now I could just work." He was given 25 years. The fifth category, national minorities with grievances against Moscow. Balts, Western Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush. These peoples had their own scores to settle with Soviet power. Deportations, Russification, suppression of national culture. All of this created fertile ground for discontent. The Germans skillfully played on national contradictions, promising Ukrainians independence, Balts the restoration of their republics, Crimean Tatars autonomy, Caucasian peoples freedom from Russian domination. These promises were lies. From Rus, Hitler planned to colonize all these territories and turn the local population into slaves or destroy them. But in 1941, many did not yet know this and believed. National legions were formed, Ukrainian police, Baltic SS units, Crimean Tatar detachments, Caucasian legions. Volunteers were found, and there were not as few as one would like to think. The sixth category, simply exhausted, tired, desperate people. The 20 years of Soviet power were heavy. Civil war, famine, collectivization, industrialization with its brutal exploitation, repressions, new famine, constant fear. People were tired. Many simply wanted this endless nightmare to end. Wanted to work calmly, raise children, not fear arrest in the middle of the night. And when the Germans came, some thought, maybe now it will be better. It can't get worse. This was a mistake. It could get worse, and it did get worse. In NKVD documents, there are numerous testimonies of such sentiments. In documents in Village N, peasants met the Germans with bread and salt. They said that they had been freed from collective farms. In City N, residents did not hinder the occupation. Some pointed out to the Germans where communists were hiding. In Town N, the Jewish population was betrayed by neighbors. This is terrifying to read, but it is the truth. An inconvenient, shameful, but truth. It is important to understand that the majority of the population did not welcome the Germans. The majority simply tried to survive. Millions fought against the invaders with weapons in their hands. Thousands went into the partisans. Hundreds of thousands worked in the rear at defense plants. They starved but forged victory. But there were others, and there were enough of them for the German occupation to proceed relatively calmly in many places in the first months. Collaborators, policemen, village elders, these were not aliens.
These were Soviet citizens whom the Soviet regime had alienated even before the war. Stalin created a system that was held together by fear even before, and when this system cracked in the summer of 1941, it turned out that many were ready to turn away from it, not out of love for Hitler, but out of hatred for Stalin. But very soon, these people realized their mistake. The Nazi occupation turned out not to be liberation, but a nightmare that overshadowed all previous sufferings. Realization came quickly, for some in a week, for some in a month. But by the Second War winter, almost everyone who had met the Germans with hope understood that they had made a terrible mistake. The first blow was the Holocaust. The Nazis began the extermination of Jews immediately after occupying the cities. These were not spontaneous pogroms. This was methodical, organized, industrial slaughter. Babi Yar near Kyiv, 33,771 people in 2 days. Drobytsky Yar near Kharkov, 15,000 people. Zmievskaya Balka in Rostov, 27,000. Ninth Fort in Kaunas, 50,000. Rumbula near Riga, 25,000. These figures are impossible to comprehend. 5. Behind each one, human lives, children, women, the elderly. They were led out of the city, forced to undress, lined up at the edge of a ditch, and shot by the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. The local population saw columns of people heading to execution, heard the shots, knew what was happening. Some hid Jews, risking their lives, but the majority remained silent out of fear, indifference, or anti-Semitism, which existed even under Soviet power. Those who had welcomed the Germans now asked themselves, what kind of liberators are these who kill entire peoples? Jews had been neighbors, colleagues, classmates, and now they were gone, just gone, destroyed in a few days. The second blow was the deportation for labor in Germany, Ostarbeiters, Eastern workers. That was what the Germans called the people they forcibly exported to work in military factories, mines, farms. Roundups began. Entire neighborhoods were cordoned off. Everyone who was caught was grabbed. Men and women from 16 to 45 years old. They grabbed everyone, loaded them into wagons, and sent them west. Relatives did not know where they were being taken or if their loved ones would ever return. In total, about 5 million people were deported from the occupied territories. Labor conditions were slave-like. They were fed just enough to swallow, beaten for the slightest offense. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day. They lived in barracks behind barbed wire, dying of exhaustion, disease, accidents. Not everyone returned. According to various estimates, 20 to 30% of those deported died. Those who survived returned with ruined health and psychological trauma. And upon return, NKVD camps awaited them, because having been in Germany meant being under suspicion. The third blow was the regime of terror. The Nazis governed the occupied territories simply. Any disobedience was punishable by death. Execution for sabotage. Execution for ties to partisans, the whole family. Execution for sheltering Jews or POWs. Execution for listening to Soviet radio. Gallows stood on squares. The Germans hanged people publicly to intimidate, forcing the population to watch the executions. Bodies were left hanging for days. Signs were hung on their chests: partisan, saboteur, friend of the Jews. Punitive operations were carried out in villages. If partisans attacked a German column, the nearest village was burned along with its inhabitants. Katyn, 149 people, including 75 children, burned alive in a barn. There were hundreds of such Katyns in Ukraine and Belarus. The fourth blow was famine. The Germans plundered the occupied territories methodically, taking food for their army.
From peasants, they took grain, livestock, potatoes. They left the minimum on the edge of survival, and often less than the minimum. In cities, a ration card system was introduced, but rations were meager. 100 to 200 grams of bread per day, and not always. People starved. Children swelled from hunger. The elderly died of exhaustion. The winters of 1941, 1942, and 1942 to 1943 were terrifying. Cold and hunger killed by the thousands. In the third winter, in Kharkov in the winter of 1941 to 1942, about 20,000 people died of hunger. Corpses lay on the streets. The Germans forbade burying them in cemeteries, carting them to mass graves outside the city. This was famine organized intentionally. The Germans considered Slavs subhumans and their lives worth nothing. The fifth blow was the realization of the Nazis' plans for the future. Gradually, it dawned on the population that the Germans had no intention of granting independence, freedom, or a worthy life.
They had seized these territories as colonies. The local population was to become slaves. Schools were closed. The Germans believed that Slavs needed only to be able to count to 100 and sign their name. No more education was required. Hospitals were closed. Medical care was intended only for Germans. Locals were left with paramedics and folk medicine. Generalplan Ost provided for the expulsion or destruction of 30 million Slavs from the territories of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. For Slavs, German settlers were to come in their place. The remaining population was planned to be turned into illiterate agricultural laborers. This plan was real. The Germans began implementing it, and people saw it. They saw that their children would not be allowed to study, that they would not be treated, that they were doomed to slavery and extinction. Those who had met the Germans with flowers now hid partisans. Those who had hoped for a better life now sabotaged work at German enterprises. Those who had believed German promises now passed intelligence to the Soviet command. There was a case in Minsk. A policeman named Kuschel served the Germans in the first months of the occupation. His father had been dekulakized in 1932, and Kuschel hated the Soviet regime. But when he saw the Germans shooting children in the Minsk ghetto, something broke inside him. He began helping the underground, warning of failures, passing on information. He was exposed and shot by the Germans in the spring of 1942. Before his death, he said, "I thought I had escaped the plague in 1942, but ended up in hell." This was a mass realization. Millions of people understood that they had made a choice in favor of monsters, compared to whom even the Stalinist regime seemed the lesser evil. And many of these people tried to atone for their guilt. The partisan movement in the occupied territories became one of the most massive in the history of wars. By the end of the war, more than 1 million people were fighting in partisan detachments. They controlled entire districts, blew up bridges and trains, destroyed garrisons, gathered intelligence. But the composition of these partisans was varied. There were career soldiers who had been encircled and refused to surrender. There were communists and Komsomol members who went into the forests for ideological reasons. There were simply patriots who could not reconcile themselves to the occupation. But there were also those who came to the partisans after experiencing Nazi occupation firsthand. People who had initially been neutral or even hopeful toward the Germans, but saw the Holocaust, the deportations for labor, the terror, and took up arms. The Holocaust in Belarus, the partisan movement was particularly strong. This was explained by geography. Forests and swamps provided cover. But there was another reason. Belarusians quickly understood that the Germans had brought not liberation, but destruction. By the end of 1942, partisans controlled a significant part of the rural areas. The Germans held the cities and roads. Everything else was partisan territory. Commander of a partisan detachment Uncle Vanya, Vasily Kors, recalled that very different people came to his detachment. There were former policemen who fled from the Germans after realizing who they were working for. There were peasants whose villages had been burned by punishers. There were youths who were supposed to be sent to Germany, and they chose to go into the forest instead. There were even former dekulakized people who had initially rejoiced at the Germans, but then took up arms against them. Kors said, "I accepted them all," asked, "Will you fight against the Germans?" They said, "I will." Then he was one of us. And what happened before doesn't matter. War excuses everything. One of us. This position was typical for many partisan commanders. They understood that people needed a chance to atone for their mistakes. In Ukraine, the partisan movement was weaker than in Belarus. There were fewer forests, making it harder to hide. But detachments operated there too. Partisans were especially active in the north of Ukraine, in the Chernihiv and Sumy regions. Sidor Kovpak, the legendary partisan commander, conducted raids deep into the enemy's rear, covering thousands of kilometers. His detachment grew from a few dozen people to several thousand. People came from occupied villages, from escaped POWs, from youth fleeing deportation to Germany. There was strict discipline in the detachments: execution for looting, execution for desertion, execution for ties to the Germans. Partisan warfare knew no mercy, but this happened in the fall of 1943, before the Red Army's offensive. The Germans could not bring up ammunition and reserves, and this facilitated the advance. Partisans destroyed garrisons, liberated entire districts where Soviet power was restored. Schools and hospitals operated until the Germans returned with punitive expeditions, gathered intelligence, and passed it through couriers to Moscow. But there was also a dark side to the partisan war. Partisans sometimes sustained their existence by taking food from peasants.
Sometimes they dealt with those they suspected of ties to the Germans without trial or investigation. Sometimes they burned villages whose residents served the occupier. Peasants found themselves between hammer and anvil. The Germans demanded they hand over food and partisans, threatening executions. The partisans demanded they feed them and not collaborate with the Germans, also threatening executions. Surviving in these conditions was incredibly difficult, but gradually the scales tipped in favor of the partisans. People saw that the Germans were losing the war. Stalingrad, Kursk, the liberation of one city after another. News of this reached the occupied territories. They listened to Soviet radio despite the bans, passed news to each other in whispers, and more people joined the partisan side. Not for ideological reasons anymore, but simply because the Red Army's victory was becoming obvious, and it was necessary to show that you had not collaborated with the occupiers, or at least to atone for your collaboration. By the end of the war, in some districts of Belarus and Ukraine, partisans represented a serious military force. They coordinated their actions with the advancing Red Army, captured bridges and crossings before regular units arrived, smashed German columns retreating west. Many partisans, after liberation, joined the Red Army and continued to fight. They reached Berlin.
They avenged the burned villages, the shot relatives. Over the years under occupation, they atoned with blood for those mistakes made in 1941. But there were those who remained on the side of the Germans until the end. Policemen, punishers, members of punitive battalions. They fought against partisans, participated in executions, burned villages. After the war, they were sought out, tried, shot, or sent to camps. Soviet propaganda portrayed collaborators as scum and traitors, but many of them were ordinary people who made the wrong choice. Some out of fear, some due to personal grievances against the Soviet regime, some simply trying to survive. But the choice was made, and they had to pay for it. The partisan movement showed that even those who met the Germans with hope eventually understood. The occupiers were enemies, ruthless, cruel enemies bringing death. And they had to be fought at any cost. But after the victory, these people faced a new ordeal. The Soviet regime did not forget who had been under occupation, and even those who had fought in the partisans came under suspicion. On May 9, 1945, the war ended. Victory, jubilation, tears of joy on the streets. But for millions of people who had survived the occupation, the war did not end. For them, the checks began. The NKVD created a system of filtration camps. All who had been in captivity, encircled, or on occupied territory had to pass through them. Everyone was checked for collaboration with the Germans. POWs were under special suspicion. Stalin believed that a true Soviet soldier should either win or die, but not surrender. Surrender was equated to treason. Even if a person was captured wounded, shell-shocked, unconscious, it didn't matter. He was a prisoner, hence a traitor. From the filtration camps, part of the POWs were sent straight to the Gulag, and according to various estimates, 15 to 20% of former prisoners received sentences. The rest were formally released, but sent to penal battalions or to hard labor in remote areas. Not everyone returned home, and not immediately. Those who served in the police or auxiliary units of the Wehrmacht were tried as traitors to the homeland, shot, or given 25 years in camps. Members of their families were exiled. Children received the stigma of son of a traitor, which ruined lives. But checks were not only for collaborators. Everyone who lived on occupied territory was checked. They were interrogated about what they did during the occupation, whether they worked for the Germans, if they knew policemen, why they didn't join the partisans. Many fell under suspicion due to denunciations. A neighbor could say that you lived well under the Germans, and that was grounds for arrest. A former colleague could report that you worked at a German enterprise and you got a sentence for aiding the occupiers, even if you just worked as a locksmith at a factory to feed your family. An atmosphere of universal suspicion was created. Those who survived the occupation became second-class citizens. When applying for jobs, they asked where you had been during the war. The answer, on occupied territory, closed many doors. They weren't admitted to the party, weren't given responsible positions, weren't allowed to enter certain institutes. People hid the fact that they had been under occupation, lied in questionnaires that they had been evacuated or fought, forged documents, asked acquaintances to write fake certificates, lived in constant fear of exposure. The Ostarbeiters, those whom the Germans had deported to work in Germany, were treated especially harshly. They were liberated by the Allies, and the Soviet command demanded repatriation. Many didn't want to return, fearing repressions, and they were right. The returning Ostarbeiters were checked especially thoroughly.
Why didn't you escape? Why didn't you sabotage the work? Why did you survive? Means you worked well for the Germans? Many received sentences simply for having been in Germany. There was a girl named Maria who was deported from Kharkov to Germany in 1942. She worked at a military factory assembling radio devices. She was liberated by the Americans in 1945. She wanted to stay in the West, but the Soviet authorities insisted on repatriation. She returned home, went through the NKVD check. They asked her why she didn't sabotage production. She replied, "They'd have beaten me." She was given 5 years for aiding the enemy. Entire peoples were punished collectively. Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, Balkars, Karachays. All of them were accused of mass collaboration with the occupiers and deported. They loaded entire villages into wagons, the elderly, women, children. They were taken to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Siberia. Many died en route or in the first months in the new place. They deported indiscriminately. Even those who fought in the Red Army received orders and medals. Even those officers were pulled from the front and sent into exile with their families. This was collective responsibility in its cruelest manifestation. The Baltic republics, after liberation, experienced a new wave of repressions. They arrested everyone who had served in German formations, but they arrested plain nationalists too, and those who had been well-to-do before the war, and those who didn't hide their dissatisfaction with the return of Soviet power. In the Baltics, a partisan war began, now against the Soviets. Forest Brothers, that's what the partisans called themselves. They fought until the early 1950s. Soviet troops suppressed the resistance brutally. There were new deportations, new arrests, new executions. Western Ukraine and Western Belarus were not calm either. Ukrainian nationalists continued the struggle. The UPA army fought both against the Germans and against the Soviets. Only by the end of the 1940s was Soviet power able to suppress the resistance. For ordinary people, the post-war years were very difficult. The country lay in ruins. The post-war year, the famine of 1946 to 1947, took millions more lives. They rebuilt everything from scratch: cities, factories, roads, bridges. They lived on a swallow, worked 12 hours a day, received meager wages. And against this background, constant checks, suspicions, arrests. People were afraid to talk about the war, afraid to remember the occupation, afraid to admit that they had been in captivity or worked under the Germans. They remained silent for decades. Only after Stalin's death in 1953 did they begin to gradually release people from camps, rehabilitate some of those convicted, but the stigma of having been under occupation remained for life. In questionnaires, they wrote where they had been during the war, and if it said on occupied territory, it affected their career, opportunities, life. The deported peoples returned to their homeland only at the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, 15 years after the deportation. In that time, many elderly people and children died. Their homes were occupied by others. The returnees had to start life anew, were occupied. The topic of occupation became taboo. In Soviet textbooks, they wrote about heroic resistance, about partisans, about the people's feat. But they didn't write about how many met the Germans with hope. They didn't write about collaborators and their numbers. They didn't write about the complexity of the choice that people faced. This topic was hushed up until the end of the Soviet era. Only in the 1990s, when the archives opened, did it become possible to speak about it honestly. And it turned out that history was much more complex than the textbooks told. But even now, 80 years later, this topic causes pain, because behind it are human destinies, mistakes, tragedies. Because, it's the story of how a totalitarian regime alienated its own citizens, and how an even more terrifying regime showed that it could be even worse. Conclusion: lessons of history without embellishments. This article is not an attempt to justify those who collaborated with the occupiers. Betrayal remains betrayal. Those policemen who participated in executions, punishers who burned villages, they were guilty and they were punished. But this article is an attempt to understand why it happened that way. Why cities surrendered without a fight. Why people met the invaders with hope. Why there were those who went to serve the occupiers. The answer is not that Soviet people were cowards or traitors. The answer is that the pre-war policy of the Soviet state alienated millions of its own citizens.
Collectivization, dekulakization, famine, mass repressions, religious persecutions. All of this created an army of dissatisfied, offended, frightened people. When the war began, many of these people saw no reason to defend the regime that had brought them so much suffering. They didn't love Hitler. They simply hated Stalin. And this hatred made them vulnerable to German propaganda. The Nazis skillfully played on these sentiments, promising freedom, land, religion, justice. People believed, and it was their tragic mistake. The Nazi occupation turned out to be a nightmare that surpassed everything that had been under Soviet power. The Holocaust, deportations for labor, mass executions, famine, terror. All of this revealed the true face of the liberators, and the majority of those who had met them with hope took up arms against them. The partisan movement, underground fighters, sabotage at enterprises. This was mass resistance, and many of those who had initially wavered participated in it. They atoned for their mistake with blood.
What can be drawn from this story?
First, a totalitarian regime that relies on fear is doomed to problems in a crisis situation. When the war came, it turned out that many Soviet citizens were not ready to fight for a system that had repressed them. This was a lesson for the authorities, but the lesson was not learned. Second, military mistakes are costly. The army's unpreparedness, the incompetence of the command, the ignoring of intelligence data, all of this led to the catastrophe of the summer of 1941. Ignoring. Millions died not in heroic battles, but in encirclements, in cauldrons, in captivity due to the mistakes of the military and political leadership. Third, people are more complex than propagandistic images. There were no simply heroes and traitors. There was a mass of people who tried to survive in inhuman conditions, made choices in situations where all options were bad, and then paid for their choice. Fourth, the truth is needed. Silencing inconvenient facts does not make them non-existent. Only an honest study of history allows us to understand what happened and not repeat mistakes. The Great Patriotic War was won. This is a feat, but this feat does not cancel the tragedies, mistakes, crimes of the authorities, and human weaknesses. Victory was achieved not thanks to the system, but in spite of it, through the courage, self-sacrifice, heroism of ordinary people. The cities that surrendered without a fight in the summer of 1941 were liberated in 1942, 1943, 1944. They were liberated by the same people who had retreated in 1941. They learned to fight. They understood what they were fighting for. They reached Berlin. This was a path from catastrophe to victory, from retreat to offensive, from defeats to triumph. And this path passed through blood, pain, mistakes, realizations. Our memory of it must be honest, with all the heroism and all the tragedies. Only then will we truly honor those who passed through this hell, and those who won.